Bonsoir, chers frères, chers compatriotes. Je voudrais vous remercier de participer dans notre réunion, notre dialogue de dimanche de CoopCongo. Sans plus tarder, je vais passer la parole d'abord à notre chairman qui va nous parler un peu. Nous sommes en train de faire la promotion de notre burial scheme. Si notre chairman peut prendre quelques minutes de nous parler à propos de notre burial scheme et on va continuer notre programme. Il est 17h03. Ceux-là qui ne sont pas déjà dans notre bridge, ils vont nous joindre petit à petit pendant que nous évoluons. Excusez-moi un peu pour ma voix, j'avais un peu de flou et je suis rétabli, mais bon, la voix n'est pas encore rétablie complètement. Merci. Je veux passer la parole maintenant au chairman. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Djeka, le secrétaire général. Merci à nos compatriotes et à nos membres d'être venus dans cette soirée. We thank you all, our members, our compatriots, Congolese from all over, for participating in this session. Donc, comme convenu, nous sommes passés à des sessions toutes les 2 semaines pour que ça nous permette tous de préparer et de mieux avancer les sessions et les titres à débattre pendant les sessions. Merci. Donc, nous sommes tous connaissants. We know that we want to be that bank for the Congolese people in Southern Africa and the world. Today, we just going to have a short introduction and we will then go through our host, Mr. Eric Malebe, who's going to talk to us about planning risks and budgeting. Monsieur Eric Malebe va encore nous parler de la planification des risques et le budget. Nous le remercions pour nous avoir tenus pendant tout le mois de mars. Thank you very much, Mr. Malebe, for your expertise, for your sharing, and for the build-up contribution to the community, the Congolese community. We really, really appreciate. We don't pay you, we don't pay people, but the knowledge is highly valuable that if we had to pay for it, we were supposed to, because it's highly valuable. Thank you very much, sir. Et après ça, nous aurons des questions. Les questions ne sont pas simplement pour les sujets qui a été partagé, mais c'est toute question qui a trait à notre coopérative et aussi au sujet qui a été partagé. Donc, nous savons que nous sommes encore en train d'attendre. Nous sommes au norming, nous sommes principalement en train d'attendre la finalisation de notre dossier auprès de la Banque centrale. On ne nous est pas encore revenu, donc dès qu'ils nous reviendront, nous pensons bien que la licence va nous donner un peu plus d'activité dans notre coopérative. La vision, c'est d'être la future banque des Congolais et nous attendons que la Banque centrale, the Reserve Bank, should come back to us. Nous avons déjà totalisé toutes les conditions de la Banque centrale en termes de minimum de membres et les minimums de montants. Et nous sommes toujours dans notre goal de vendre les parts qui restent. Nous avons encore à peu près 900 000 parts. Vous voyez que le total de parts qui est déjà réservé, c'est plus d'1 million. Donc, tout ce que les gens font maintenant, c'est payer les frais pour les parts qu'ils ont déjà réservées. Donc, il nous reste 900 000. Donc, quand ce sera fini, ce sera une autre longue histoire. Les opportunités seront énormes. So we'll have a lot of opportunities in terms of saving products, credit products, and community products. Donc, nous avons trois grandes lignes de produits. Les produits d'épargne, les produits de crédit et les produits que nous appelons communautaires. Donc, les produits d'épargne, nous avons les savings. Donc, ce sont des comptes comme toutes les banques. Le saving account, le check account, le fixed account. Et puis, nous avons aussi les produits de crédit. Nous allons donner des crédits à nos membres à court terme et à long terme. Et aussi, nous avons des produits que nous appelons communautaires. Et M. Djeka, le secrétaire général, a parlé de notre plan funéraire congolais. C'est un plan que nous avons déjà discuté l'année passée. C'est un plan, nous sommes en train maintenant de recruter les membres. Nous avons fait des présentations avec funéraire. So the barrier scheme, we did do a lot of presentation discussions in this forum. And you can find the videos on the YouTube. Donc, les vidéos de ces discussions sont sur le YouTube. Ou bien, si vous avez besoin de commentaires, vous pouvez aussi demander au secrétaire général ou bien à notre administratrice qui saura vous en donner beaucoup plus de détails. Donc, celui-là, nous sommes en train de recruter les membres pour le plan funéraire. Donc, dans notre cheminement, nous avons ces produits-là et nous attendons la licence pour que nous puissions commencer les prêts à nos membres. Les membres reçoivent les relevés, so members are receiving statements. Nous sommes déjà à mesure, nous sommes déjà à mesure de donner l'accès aux membres au système Quara pour que les gens peuvent voir leur account 24 heures sur 24. Il restait des détails pour combiner les ID numbers, les passeports et les autres types de IDs pour que ça puisse finaliser. So we had a small issue with some ID numbers, the type, the format, because we have people with multiple IDs. So it was a matter of now trying to customize the product so that it accepts all the type of IDs that we have. Donc, parce que nous avons beaucoup de types de ID. On a de l'Europe, de l'Amérique, de l'Afrique du Sud. Ici, il y en a à peu près 3 ou 4. Donc, c'était ça le problème. Mais tout est prêt pour que nos membres puissent maintenant être à mesure de voir leur compte eux-mêmes. Bon, bien sûr, nous allons continuer à donner les relevés, mais les membres auront accès directement à leur compte dans leur banque. Le bureau, le numéro, c'est 012 320 20 79. Donc, on va ajouter ça ici. Le numéro, c'est 320 et puis 27. Donc, c'est ça notre numéro du bureau. Si vous voulez appeler au bureau, vous pouvez utiliser ce numéro et notre administratrice, Sarah, qui est là-bas, pourra vous aider avec vos questions. Elle est disponible de 10h à 16h tous les jours au bureau là-bas. L'éducation continuelle, c'est ce que nous faisons maintenant. Demain, il y a une session, le 29 mardi, il y a une session avec NCR, National Credit Regulator. La Banque centrale nous a envoyé une invitation. Je pense que je vais copier ça encore et partager, où ils nous ont demandé que nos membres puissent prendre part à ces sessions-là d'éducation, que le National Credit Regulator, l'agence de crédit de l'Afrique du Sud, est en train et continue toujours à éduquer les gens pour que vous sachiez quels sont vos droits, quels sont vos devoirs, dans quelle situation vous pouvez vous défendre. Il y a beaucoup de situations. Ils sont toujours en train d'éduquer les communautés, les membres de la communauté. Donc, cette invitation nous a été donnée, comme toujours. Nous avons partagé, je crois que Mme Sarah avait partagé ça. On va encore partager parce que on a dit que la clôture d'enregistrement, c'est demain à midi. So please register for that educational at National Credit Regulator so that you empower yourself with some of the details. Nous avons terminé notre année financière le 28 février, donc nous préparons l'Assemblée générale. La date sera informée à temps. We will tell of the AGM date time. Voilà donc, Monsieur Malebe va nous parler de risk planning and budgeting et merci beaucoup pour votre attention. Monsieur Njeka, voilà, j'ai terminé pour le moment. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Chairman. Sans plus tarder, je veux passer la parole à notre interlocuteur, Monsieur Malebe. Il va parler plus en anglais, mais si vous avez besoin de clarification en français, n'hésitez pas de lui arrêter et de lui demander, s'il vous plaît. Merci. Eric?
OK, merci, secrétaire général. Merci pour la parole. Like you've said, I'll try my best to mix français and anglais. A lot of the terms and things like that, unfortunately, I only know them in English, but we will try to simplify things to make the point of the presentation is to educate ourselves, to educate each other, and to learn. So it's not about using fancy language or anything like that. Secretary General, the other thing I also want to say before I start is the last meeting, we got a lot of questions that were, I can say, almost personal in nature. So I just want to make it clear that these presentations is not financial advice, it's financial information, okay? So if you have a specific financial situation where you need financial advice, I would recommend that you speak to a financial advisor. There's a lot of financial advisors, as you know, in the industry, simply because financial advice has to be very, it has to be individual. It can't be a general discussion. Everybody's financial situation is different. So treat this as a meeting to get financial information, not financial advice. Financial advice has to be a one-to-one, face-to-face discussion with your financial advisor. So I think that's very important. Okay. So
thank you for that.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yes. No, I just wanted to say thank you for the clarification. Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Secretary General. Okay, so without spending too much time on disclaimer, so today we're going to talk about risk management. Okay, so risk management in finance is a very broad term. Depending on which part of finance you are talking about, risk management can mean different things. Okay, but at a very high level, risk doesn't matter which industry you're in. Risk is the possibility that your outcome is different from what you expected or what you planned. That's just basic. You planned for A, there's a risk that A might not happen. Okay, so when you talk about it in personal finance, we look at different aspects of someone's life, and we look at how we can manage those uncertainties better. Okay, so if you've been in these discussions over time, you'll understand we spoke about savings, we spoke about retirement, we spoke about investment. And in all of those aspects, we spoke about how do we manage the risk better. If you remember back to retirement and investment in particular, we know that there are things like inflation that can affect how much returns you get from your investment. There are things like taxes that will affect how much you get, but there's also risk. There's country risk. Something happens in a country, it will affect your investment. Something happens in another country, it will affect your investment. People that trade in commodities, for example, they know that when there's a war, the prices of commodities generally will go up because of demand and supply, and they make money from that kind of information. So all those things are part of our daily lives. And it's important to understand what are the risks and also what are the tools we have in finance to mitigate against those risks. Now, all our discussions are about personal finance. So we're talking about your finance for you as your for you and your family. We're not talking about the war in Ukraine or whatever. Yes, it will affect you, but we want to bring it down to the family. How does risk affect the family, the household, and how can you plan better with those kind of things? So this slide just talks about the different risks that we try to manage in finance. At the top are all the good things like savings, retirement, investment, and at the bottom is the bad things. You know, you could lose your job, you could get divorced, or you could go bankrupt for whatever reason, or you have too much debt, things like that. Because you lost your job, now there's a bond, they take your house, they repossess your car. Those are realities that happen in the world. And with better planning, we can manage these things a lot better. So I'm just going to do a quick summary, I can say, of what we've covered. We spoke in the beginning of our sessions, we spoke about the difference between saving and investment, where saving is about putting money away to use when, in case of an emergency. We know that a saving is a very low risk type of investment, where investment in its own is about generating wealth. So investment is about increasing your capital over time, or what we call capital appreciation, okay? And investment and savings has an element of risk. Investment is more risk, meaning more return. Saving is less risk, meaning less return, but it's safer, and it's safer and it's more liquid. Okay, so we went from that and then we started talking about how to invest. What are the different options you have when you invest? And we spoke about terms like assets. We said investing is all about understanding the different assets and how those assets react to each other. Okay, and we spoke about asset allocation, meaning how do we combine different assets to maximize our returns? Okay, and if you remember, the assets we talked about were things like properties, shares. We spoke about unit trusts. We spoke about all sorts of different assets, and we classified assets depending on how risky the market perceives that asset. So, for example, a Bitcoin as an asset is much higher risk than putting your money in a fixed deposit account. And for you to make money over time, you need to have the right combination of low risk and high risk assets. And in the investment world, that process is called diversification. Okay, so if you are diversified or you have money invested in a lot of different assets, you reduce the amount of risk you take in. Okay, and it's basic logic. We also talk about what you should consider when you invest. You should consider your objectives. You know, do you need to have access to the money, short term, medium term, long term? What is the time frame you're looking at? What are the tax considerations? So it's just a summary of the first session we had. The second session we had, we spoke about retirement. Again, retirement also introduces another risk. Retirement is a very long-term strategy of maybe 20, 30 years. It's about how do you make sure that you can sustain your living standards after you retire. Maybe you'll retire with 50%, 60% of your current salary. How do you manage that? And also we talked about what happens after retirement, because you may retire at 65, for example, but you might be living for another 30 years after that retirement date. You know, so when you're planning for retirement, it's not just about 65, but it's also about what happens after that. Maybe at 75, you want to be able to buy a new car, but you're not working anymore. So how do you plan for things like that? And financial planning, broadly speaking, is just about planning. That's all it is. It's how do we plan for these uncertainties that happen in life? We then looked at the different options we have in the market when it comes to retirement. We spoke about a pension fund, a provident fund, a retirement annuity. We said the retirement annuity is only different in that the retirement annuity is independent from your company. So if you work for a company, you'll likely have a pension and a provident fund. If you don't work for a company, or if your company doesn't offer that option, you have to take out a retirement annuity. Now, we also mentioned that the way the laws are changing in this country, in South Africa, they are trying to align pension, provident, and retirement annuity. In that sense that right now, there's no difference. You know, there used to be a difference with, in one scenario, you can take a lump sum. The other scenario, you can take 2/3. Now they've normalized it. They're normalizing those laws across all those different funds. Okay, so that covers what we've discussed in the past few weeks. So then we start talking about risk. Okay, so risk management is about how do we, as much as possible, manage the uncertainties that we have in our lives, okay, from a financial perspective. So what we talk about in finance is, we call it a risk development, a risk management development plan. Okay, that's a lot of words to say that there are 4 ways you can manage risk. Okay, the first way is to avoid risk. Okay, so financially speaking, avoid risk means don't invest in risky assets, for example. That obviously has other implication. Maybe you don't make such a good return if you avoid risk, you know, so it's not always a viable strategy. The next strategy would be to reduce the risk. Okay, so if you've got $100 in your account, instead of putting all the 100 in a high risk asset, maybe put only 60% in a high risk asset, keep the 40 in a lower risk asset. Okay, and that sort of makes sense. It's a good way to reduce the risk. Okay, I'm going to skip number 3, and then we have risk retention. Risk retention is to say, okay, I understand the risk. It's a very risky situation, but I accept the risk. Okay, and people do this all the time. For example, people that don't take out insurance for their cars, they understand that there's a high risk that I can be involved in an accident. If I don't have insurance, I'll find a way to pay for it myself. Those kind of situations. People that decide to apply that last strategy of risk retention, you usually do it for smaller events. Okay, so the car is probably one of the biggest events, but maybe I know in our community, for example, the concept of medical insurance doesn't really exist. So if someone gets sick, you take on that risk that you will fund that medical bill, if someone is ill. So that's a form of risk retention. And then the main one is risk transfer. And from a financial perspective, this is very important, because what you can effectively do is say, I'm going to transfer this risk to an institution to manage that risk for me. Okay, so the risk transfer is usually with things like life insurance. So we see on TV, they talk about a life policy or life cover, disability cover, etc., etc., etc. That's a way of transferring risk, because that now means that for a small premium that I pay every month, if something were to happen to me, this company will cover my costs, whether it's disability or death, or I get a dread disease, as they call it, cancer or something like that. This company will cover that risk and will pay for my treatment, will pay for my family's well-being and standard of living. Okay, so this is just to give you an idea of the different risk options we have and what they actually mean. Okay, so when we're talking about risk, we're talking about things that are uncertain. Now, there's a part of finance that talks about estate planning, which is talking about things that are certain. Okay, so for example, death is certain. We're all going to die. We just don't know when we're going to die, but we're going to die. Tax is a certainty. When you die in South Africa, in most developing nations, you will get taxed for dying, because when you die, effectively, it's seen as a disposal of your assets. So it's seen as you are selling your assets when you die. As I was very happy to see that there's a discussion about marriage and matrimonial property act. So marriage regimes, whether it's out of community, in community, etc. So depending on how you manage that, and we'll discuss that a bit more here, you can save on your taxes, right? You can pay less tax depending on how you manage that process. But when you pass away at a very high level, you will pay tax. Okay, so that is a different type of risk, because it's a certainty that it will happen. Okay, so what I then decided to do is to show the different assets that people are invested in and what happens when you pass away. Okay, so if you have a savings account, for example, when you pass away, that will be included as your property. Okay, and what that means is that it's an asset under your name. When you pass away, it is liable for tax. The tax is called estate duty. Okay, so if you've got certain assets that you're not transferring to your spouse, when you pass away, you are taxable for that asset. If you have investments, it's even worse, because with investments, you have estate duty, which is the normal tax. You have capital gains tax, which is a tax on capital, on increase in your asset. So if you bought your investment at R1, $1, when you die, it's worth $5. That means there was a growth of $4. You will pay tax on that $4. The tax is about 20% of the growth of that value minus certain exclusion. Okay. If you made any donations, there's donations tax. So when you pass away and you decided to donate something to your children, for example, there's going to be a tax on that. If we talk about retirement fund assets, so these are assets that are part of your retirement. So that's your pension fund, your provident fund, or your retirement annuity, or even the preservation fund. Those also get taxed. There's a tax table called lump sum benefits. Okay, so when you pass away, there will be a tax on that lump sum. If you get your retirement before you pass away, you also get taxed on that as an income. So if they treat it as a salary that you're getting, you will be taxed on that. If you have a property, a primary residence, a house, if it's over a certain value, it will be taxed. Okay. The way to avoid this is if you, for example, married in community of property, when you pass away, you can leave the property under your wife's name or transfer it to your wife's name or your spouse's name, sorry. So that in that scenario, you would not pay tax. but obviously when your spouse passes away, they'll catch up with you, and that tax will then be higher when the spouse passes away. So basically, when you die in most developing countries, it's also a very expensive exercise. Okay, so I'm still a bit young, I can say that, but I've seen in our communities, in the Congolese communities, maybe Papa was very wealthy, Papa had a lot of assets, but after Papa passed away, things became messy. This uncle wants that house, this uncle wants that house, or the one uncle feels that he's entitled to these assets, etc. It becomes very messy. And I think over time, just my experience, I'll be happy to get people's views on this. Over time, it's almost become like a culture for us that when the primary breadwinner passes away, there's always something that goes. There's some disagreements, and this one must get that, etc. So it becomes very messy, and it's very unfortunate because I've seen this scenario happen with poorer families and also wealthy families where the planning was not done. And the point I'm making is that this is not difficult things that we're talking about. It's not rocket science. It's just planning. It's about planning, having a basic understanding of what you're working with and planning better. And I think with that kind of mindset, we can really change things in our community. Okay, so when you talk about risk transfer, it is the most efficient way to build a legacy for your family. Okay, because when you pass away, even if you have all these assets that you accumulated, you have houses, you have cars, you have shares, etc. When you pass away, all those assets will be taxed. Okay, so you can't escape that. Also, when you pass away, in many of these countries, there's a lot of administration that needs to be done. What do I mean by that? So, for example, there has to be an executor to execute your estate. Okay, so that means there has to be someone you have to nominate that will do the administration of your estate to make sure your will is respected. X member gets X amount, X member gets X amount, find the people that are on your will, etc. So there's a cost involved in that. There's also an impact on your family because the primary breadwinner is gone. So now a house, for example, you may leave your family with a house, but it's not very liquid. You can't eat a house, right? So they need funds. They need liquid to be able to survive, to be able to maintain the standard of living. So risk transfer is now a process that you can use to make a commercially sound decision. What does that mean? You can create liquidity. You can find a way to increase your savings, okay? And you can make sure that your family has some kind of funds that are tax-free that will pay out in the event of a death, okay? So at the end of the day, what I'm trying to encourage here is that, number one, a life cover or life policy or life insurance, as it's known, is very important because it creates liquidity in your estate. If you think about all the different costs that you have to incur when someone passes away, you think about the taxes that you have to pay when someone passes away. That's why when you buy a house, for example, in South Africa, it's almost impossible to buy a house without the bank telling you that you must take out insurance for that house, because they know when you die or if you die before that house is paid off, they don't have to worry about them not getting their money back. The insurance covers that. So why is it that we don't think like that as well? That if I die and I don't have insurance, what's going to happen to the family? So this is a very, very important tool. And I must also say, what I'm sharing here is not new groundbreaking information. A lot of communities know these things. They've been doing it for years and years and years. And I think for us, it's just understanding that death is a certainty. It will happen to you. It will happen. There's no way around it. So now it's about how best do we position ourselves from a financial perspective to minimize the impact of death in our family. Okay, so we already talked about the burial assistance, which is very important. But when you talk about life insurance, it's now about your whole estate. How do you consider your house, your living standards for your family, school fees, any debts that you have that need to be paid off? You don't want to die and leave your family with a burden of having to pay for all these bills. Okay, so when we talk about estate planning, really what we're saying is we want to bring certainty to your family. When you pass away, there must be a level of certainty that some things will be taken care of. There's already a lot of stress. There's already a lot going on. You don't want to add financial issues as an additional stress for the family. So you create certainty by planning better. You also make sure that your debts are taken care of. So any debts that you may have, your bond, your car, etc., with risk transfer, you're able to minimize those impacts. And then obviously tax. There's going to be tax that's going to be paid. Your risk transfer can then cater for that tax. There's also a lot of stability that comes with this, because once you've started planning, you can start sort of seeing a few steps ahead what the impacts are going to be when you've transferred this kind of risk. Okay, so for example, if you had certain wishes that you put on a will, we're not talking about a will here explicitly, but of course, a will is very important. It's very, very important. I know that in some countries, maybe the will is not as respected as it should be. But it's important for at least everybody to know what are the wishes of the person of the deceased. It's important for them to know that at least there's something to work with. Okay. You also need to have someone that can preserve your documentation. Okay. So in our world, in the younger generation right now, our world is we're very online. Right? We have a Facebook account, an Instagram account, we bank online, we have online banking, etc. So in our world right now, when someone passes away, we have to think about who's got my passwords. Because if I've got the password for someone that's deceased, I can at least close accounts, I can close all sorts of online presence, things like that, which 20 years ago, that's not something that people would have thought about. But it's important to think about those things now, because everything is going digital. So you need to have stability around the documentations, your wills, your policies, your retirement annuities, your retirement funds. When you have an estate plan, you've at least got a way of preserving that kind of information. And then the last thing is security. You want to bring some kind of security for your family. So life insurance is very important because life insurance pays out tax-free. It pays out a lump sum. Okay. So that's very important because a retirement fund, for example, when someone passes away, it takes a long time for the retirement fund to pay out. Because if you remember what we mentioned in our retirement discussion, a retirement fund is governed by what's called the Pension Funds Act, okay? The South African Pension Funds Act says that the retirement fund must be managed by a board of trustees, okay? The trustees of the retirement fund pay out your funds based on your financial dependence, okay? Not based on your will. So in your will, you can say, when I die, my retirement funds should go to my children, for example. But the trustees, if your trustees find that there are other financial dependents that are not in your will, the trustees have a right to divert some of your funds to your other financial dependents. Okay, so of course that can be a challenge. Maybe there's other kids that no one knew about. For example, they are entitled to your retirement funds. Okay, so at least when you've got an estate plan, you're starting to build walls of security for your family. When we start getting more advanced with these discussions, we can start talking about things like protection of assets. So typically what a lot of people that are very wealthy in developed and developing countries, what they do with their assets is they remove their assets from their estate. They start talking about things like trusts, setting up a trust, and effectively the trust becomes like a legal entity, right? So you move all your assets, all the assets that they own is not under their name, it's under the name of the trust, meaning that if there's any debts, the debt cannot be claimed against those properties because those properties don't belong to the individual, they belong to the trust. Okay, so obviously that's now at a very high level where you've got sufficient assets to justify having a trust. But we have to start thinking in that space because we've got a lot of Congolese people in our community that have those kind of assets, but maybe are not considering the financial implications of death, which is a certainty. Okay, and then estate planning ensures that your death is a cost-effective and a flexible situation. What I mean by that, obviously, death, there's no flexibility in that, but life changes. So you can come up with a plan now, and then in 10 years' time, your life has completely changed. Your plan has to also adapt to that. Okay, so you have to think about how you make a plan that's very, very flexible to the changes in life. Okay, so this is just talking at a very high level of what is estate planning. Okay, so it's all about, we spoke about the uncertainties or the risks in life. Estate planning talks about the certainties in life, okay? And how do you manage that risk? You manage that risk by transferring that risk from yourself to a financial institution. I think over time, what we can do with the Secrétaire Général is start getting people like actuaries. Actuaries are people that work with premiums. They'll be able to tell you why you're paying a certain premium for a certain insurance product, for example, what affects those premiums. But it's very important in our community that we start planning and thinking about what happens when you pass away. How do you leave a legacy for your family? We don't want to be in a situation where our families are constantly starting from scratch after the primary breadwinner is gone. We need to be able to give them a better start when we are no longer there. Okay, so the next part of our discussion is to talk about personal financial management and budgeting. Okay. So I think budgeting is a very well-known term. We know what budgeting is. So what I'm going to show you is not very new, but it's just a logical flow of how to think about this, and not to get into too much detail of your budget must have X, Y, Z, etc. I think that's something that you can decide as you work through the information. Okay, so before we go into budgeting, it's important to understand what is personal financial management. Okay, so financial management, like the term says, financial management is managing your finances, right? So it's about how do you manage your assets, how do you manage your liabilities, how do you manage your cash flow, where are you spending your cash? So now when we add the word personal, we are now looking at it from a household perspective, from a family perspective. Okay, so personal financial management is about understanding where's your cash flow in your house. Okay, how are you managing your debt in your house? And are there any additional monies that you have or that you're misusing that can be targeted differently? So when we speak about wealthy individuals, Dangote or I don't know, Bill Gates, whoever, we talk about their net worth. Okay, they'll say Bill Gates is a billionaire. He's got a net worth of X amount. Okay, so when we're talking about net worth, what we are saying is we're looking at the assets of that individual less the liabilities of that individual. Okay, and then that calculation, simple basic calculation, will say this individual has a net worth of X amount. Okay, so this is an exercise that's very important for us to do in our household, in our families, because number one, it helps us understand where our debt is and where we need to start planning to pay off our debts faster, because you want to always try to pay the debts off, the most expensive debts that you have, to pay those off first before you start going into investment. If you remember the discussions we've had, we said that investment is something you want to do with what we call your discretionary income. Okay, that means discretionary income means your income after you've covered your necessities, after you've covered your debt. You then have some money left over. That then becomes the money you use to invest. So in an ideal situation, to be able to understand what is your discretionary income, you need to be able to understand what is your net worth, where are your big debts, and how do you manage those debts. So then we start talking about budgeting. Okay, so personal financial management is almost before budgeting, because budgeting is short, medium term. Personal financial management is long term. Assets, we have what we call current assets, which are short term, and we've got non-current assets, which are more longer term. So for example, your house is a longer term asset, okay? And depending on where you are in your payments, it's also a long-term liability. So you cannot treat an asset, for example, you cannot treat your house, for example, the same way you'll treat your car, because the time frames are different, okay? So even when you're doing your personal financial management, those will be treated differently. Your budget talks about your month-to-month income and expenses. So we're not talking about your assets and liabilities. Here we're talking about your income, money coming in, and your expenses, money going out, okay? And the point of budgeting is to identify what your financial resources are. So where are you making money? To better understand where you are spending money, what are your spending habits? And then coming up with an effective way to improve that situation. Okay, so budgeting is always something you start with as a short-term monitoring of your expenses and your income, and then trying to find a better way to reduce your expenses and to obviously increase your income. Where financial management, we're looking more at your assets and your liabilities. So I just put together 5 steps on how to prepare a budget. So the best way to start is to go through your bank statement for this current month and start seeing where are your incomes, where are your expenses, start noting that down. You will then split your income on one side, your expenses on another side. You list where your sources of income are, where your sources of expenses are. You compare the two, and then you'll say, okay, this is my budget for the month. You have to always end at 0. So your money, your income must always tie back to your expenses. You must not have any money left over. Okay, so when you're doing your calculation for your budget, every bit of money must be accounted for. Otherwise, there's a money leaking somewhere that you cannot identify. So you have to account for every cent that you spend in your account. Okay, and then step 5 is to review this process regularly. Maybe every 2 or 3 months, you see, okay, this is how I'm doing. This is how I'm tracking my finances. What can I do better? Okay, and if you think back to the items we've covered, we know that, for example, your life cover or your life insurance has to be part of your budget, because we're trying to build legacies for our families. You have to make provision for life insurance. You have to make provision for retirement. What happens when you retire? If you're self-employed, it's even more important. You need to have a plan. You need to have a plan for emergencies. What happens if there's an emergency? And I know every situation is unique. People have different scenarios, but you want to plan it as much as possible. So you'll see here there's different formats of budgeting that you can use. There's free software online, so it's not a difficult thing anymore to find budget. There's free software that you can download on Google. There's templates. You can just choose whatever template that works for you and start tracking it. You can even do it on your phone. So there's a lot of ways now that you can track your budget. So the information is out there. It's available. You just have to pick what works for you. The point is to start. I think that's the main thing when it comes to budgeting and financial planning. Okay, so the last bit of information is about the benefits of having an emergency fund, which is still part of budget. So an emergency fund is part of what we call savings. Okay, so an emergency fund should not be something that's in a high risk investment. It should be something that's easy to access, easy to get into your account. So this will be a savings account, a fixed deposit account, notice, 32-day notice, those kind of products. And it's really important because it helps you in the case of emergencies. That's the point of emergency fund. And at the bottom, I just added some basic, what we call financial ratios. And it's just a way for you to do I can call it a health check of your finances, right? So we spoke about your net worth. So you can see how solvent you are. Solvency or solvent means how are you able to meet your long-term debts? Your long-term debts, as we've mentioned, are things like your house. That's a long-term debt. So there's a small little formula that we use here. Your net worth, which is obviously your assets minus your liabilities, divided by your assets, will give you a value. Obviously, that value on its own doesn't mean anything, but you have to compare it with you have to compare it over time for it to start making sense, in that you're becoming more solvent or you're becoming less solvent. And it's just a way to do a financial health check, if we can call it that. Liquidity, how liquid is your household income? Liquidity or liquid in financial terms means how quickly can you convert your assets into cash? That's effectively the meaning of liquidity. Okay, so to get that ratio, we divide your current assets with your current liabilities. So current, when you see the word current, we're talking about short term. Okay, so current short-term assets divided by your short-term liabilities, and it's just a ratio to measure how are you able to manage your short-term debts. Okay, and again, it's on its own is just a number, but it's better to use it relative to the previous months or the previous years. Over time, you can start seeing a pattern of how you're managing your finances. And then there's a savings ratio. Basically, how much of your income is going into savings. So I've read a book called, and I know it's one of our recommended books, called The Richest Man in Babylon. It's a very, very good book. And in that book, they talk about they talk a lot about personal finance. So it's very rich in information. But there's a concept there about paying yourself first. Okay, and that basically says that out of the money that you make that comes in, you need to pay yourself at least 10% first before you start spending the money. So the savings ratio is a way to encourage that, to say, ideally, you should be saving about 10 to, I put you at 30%. I know it's unrealistic. We have debts, we have all sorts of things that we need to consider, but to try and save and to live below your means as much as possible. So the savings ratio is just a very basic calculation to give you that, that measure of how much of your income is actually going into savings. And obviously you want to increase that ratio over time. Okay, so that is the last slide on the presentation. I think we can take questions if there are any questions. Sorry, Secrétaire Général, maybe you want to do a summary en français before we take questions?
Hello? Can you hear me?
Oui, I can hear you.
Okay. I lost my connection a little bit. Je voudrais vraiment remercier Eric pour le mois de mars ici qu'il a passé avec nous. Nous n'avons pas assez de temps. Nous sommes supposés terminer à 18 heures. Je voudrais demander votre indulgence pour que nous puissions un peu dépasser le temps. Et au lieu que je donne le summary, il y a déjà une main qui est levée, mais je veux rapidement parler peut-être en français pour ceux-là qui ont un peu de problèmes avec l'anglais. Eric a donné un peu le résumé de ce qu'il avait donné à la première session, et puis deuxième session. La première session sur la diversification, il faut diversifier la manière et là où nous investissons pour minimiser les risques. Et notre deuxième session, il nous avait parlé sur le retirement, ou bien notre pension. Nous devons penser à la pension. Selon les statistiques, aujourd'hui, les gens vivent plus longtemps qu'ils ne vivaient avant. Nous avons beaucoup de facteurs qui font que nous vivons un peu plus longtemps. Nous allons au gym régulièrement. Nous regardons ce que nous mangeons. Nous ne mangeons plus n'importe quoi comme on mangeait auparavant. Et ça fait que nous vivons un peu plus longtemps et nous devons prendre en considération, lorsque nous travaillons, que nous pourrions vivre un peu après notre âge de pension. Mon papa, par exemple, va célébrer bientôt, là, c'est 90 ans d'âge. Donc, nous vivons vraiment longtemps. Et aujourd'hui, dans notre troisième session, on a parlé de risques. On peut mettre nos risques de côté, on peut le réduire ou on peut les transférer. Ce qu'il a expliqué ici en Afrique du Sud, par exemple, il y a beaucoup des entreprises, des assurances où nous pouvons investir dans le retirement. Donc, lorsque nous allons arrêter de travailler, on peut toujours prolonger notre vie. Et pendant ce temps-là, on aura peut-être besoin d'une nouvelle voiture. On peut faire ses prévisions, prendre soin de nos familles avec l'assurance vie. Lorsque nous ne sommes plus là, comme il a donné l'exemple, le quotidien que nous vivons dans nos familles, lorsque le papa part, c'est le catastrophe. Donc, les enfants qui étaient les enfants des riches, tout d'un coup, la vie s'arrête et il y a les oncles qui viennent pour demander les choses aussi. Donc, il y a le chambardement comme ça et les enfants se retrouvent parfois dans la rue. Hier, le papa était millionnaire. Aujourd'hui, les enfants sont dans la rue. Donc, avec le testament, nous pouvons éviter ce genre de choses. Il est allé un peu plus loin. Pour ceux-là qui, après avoir travaillé pendant longtemps, ils ont accumulé beaucoup d'assets, des maisons, des biens. Et les riches commencent à faire ce qu'on appelle le trust. Donc, au lieu que mes biens soient mes biens, je prends ces biens et je les attache au trust. Et avec le trust, je protège mes biens pour ma progéniture, pour même moi-même, pour éviter aussi beaucoup de taxes. Parce que en Afrique du Sud et dans des pays évolués, lorsqu'on est mort, il y a le gouvernement qui vient pour taxer. Ce que tu gardais à la banque, on va taxer 20%. Si tu transfères ta maison à ton partenaire, il y a la taxe qui pourra être mise ou ça peut être transféré lorsque vous êtes en communauté de biens, mais lorsque le deuxième partenaire va aussi décéder pour transférer aux enfants, le gouvernement viendra aussi pour taxer. Et il y a un moyen pour éviter ce genre de surtaxation avec le gouvernement lorsque nous attachons nos biens au trust. Et aussi, lorsque nous sommes en train de travailler, il faut toujours prévoir un pourcentage pour nous-mêmes. Je me souviens moi-même, lorsque je revenais des voyages, souvent j'achète tout pour toute la famille et ma femme qui me demande « Qu'est-ce que tu as acheté pour toi ?» Et très souvent, je n'achetais rien pour moi-même. Et ici, le conseil, c'est prends soin de toi de 10% jusqu'à 30%, 20%. Tu dois être saine d'abord pour bien travailler et bien prendre soin de ta famille. Et à la fin, on a parlé aussi de budget. Et pendant que le budget est vraiment difficile pour nos familles, mais Eric nous a conseillé de budgétiser. C'est très important de budgétiser et pendant que nous faisons nos budgets, il faut prendre soin de notre pension, il faut prendre soin de notre famille. Après nous mourrons un jour nous tous. Et puis, les urgences. Nous avons de temps en temps les urgences, surtout nous, les familles congolaises. Il y a de temps en temps un oncle, un cousin qui est décédé. Il faut sortir l'argent en urgence ou un membre de famille qui n'a pas de medical aid, par exemple. Il faut sortir l'argent en urgence. La voiture qui tombe en panne, il faut sortir l'argent en urgence. Donc, nous avons vraiment besoin de budget pour ça. Merci beaucoup. C'est un peu le résumé que je voudrais partager. Sans plus tarder, je vais ouvrir le floor pour les questions. Il y a déjà, j'ai vu, il y a beaucoup déjà de chats, mais je voudrais d'abord donner la parole à Eunice qui avait déjà levé la main pendant que je parlais. Eunice, s'il vous plaît, vous pouvez en mute. Allô? Mandiangu, you can unmute and take the floor, please. Pour gagner le
Secrétaire
temps.
général,
Oui?
sorry, I see Eunice did type 2 questions in the chat. I can respond to the chat.
Okay. Okay. Thanks, Eric. You can have the floor.
No problem. Okay. So the first question, if I want to finance a project, for example, building a cottage or something like that, is it okay to use the emergency funds? Meaning using your savings to finance the project. Okay. So very good question. I think the first thing is number one, this is not financial advice. Okay. So, and I'm saying that because that question, you're not giving a full financial picture. I don't have a full picture of, for example, do you have other debts? How much do you spend per month? Do you have other investments? Do you have under savings, etc.? So my answer is going to be based on just what you've said there. Okay. So if we think back to investments, we spoke about different assets. Okay, and depending on the assets, an asset will have certain risk. For example, property is maybe lower risk than other assets or other like shares, etc. Property is a bit lower risk, okay? And you feel that it will generate an income. Okay, let me park that. The other part to consider is that an emergency fund is for emergencies. Meaning, for example, you have your car breaks down, you can't go to work anymore without your car. It has to go to the mechanic. Maybe they need 20, 30,000 Rand or whatever to fix the car. You don't want to go and get a loan to do something like that. Use your emergency fund. It's for emergencies. Okay. So in that context, I think you have to make an informed decision based on those two facts. If you've got a lot of people will want to have at least 3 to 6 months emergency funding. That's the recommendation before you can stop investing in it. What I mean by that is that if you were to lose your job today, will you be able to survive for 6 months without a salary? Now, of course, to build that from your emergency fund is going to take a long, long time. Okay, so it's not very fair. And that's why I'm saying without getting a full picture, it's difficult to say. Maybe you feel that you're going to buy a building in a very secure place. It's guaranteed to make money, so you'll be able to recover that money. That's an option. But at a very basic level, an emergency fund is for emergencies. And you have to try your best to keep it that way, because you want to build this, but maybe you also need to get a new car and you're short 5,000 rands, which you can take from you decide to take from your emergency fund, for example. So without getting a full picture, I can say that try as much as possible to not use your emergency fund. Keep your emergency fund for emergencies. Try to find other ways to finance that kind of project. But if you feel that the project is going to be lucrative, it's in a very good area, you've done your research, you feel that this is going to make a lot of money, I think then, that's a different discussion. But just at a high level, that would be my recommendation. Your second question, there are lots of taxes in South Africa, for example. Is it a good idea to invest back home? For example, to buy a house back home or have businesses back home? Okay. So my knowledge on the legal framework in Congo is very limited. The information I know about the legal framework in Congo is secondhand information based on people's experiences. I've heard sometimes you buy a parcel. After 2 years, you find out that someone else also bought your parcel. Now you have to go to court to dispute that, or your parcel was 300 square meters. Now it's 295 square meters because someone took a part of it. So I don't know what the legal framework is like there. It's true that the taxes in South Africa are very high, excessive taxes, but South Africa provides a level of certainty around the legal framework. Okay, there's a certain things that we know that that gives South Africa a level of stability and certainty. So you have to make that decision. At the end of the day, je suis Congolais, like you. It's our home. We want to go there. We want to build there. We want to build our assets there. We want to create wealth there. We want to be able to go there for holidays and things like that. So it's also a very emotional decision. It's not just the financial decision. If you're looking at it from purely financial, you have to say one side is higher risk because maybe the legal framework is not very certain. The other side has also risk, but there's some certainty on the policy side. There's high taxes, but you sort of know what's going to happen should you pass away or a life event changes. And I think that is an individual decision. Personally, I would want us to invest more in Congo. That's something that we have to do. But the fact is, those are the facts. The legal framework is uncertain, and you have to manage that information how best you can. I don't know if that answers your question. If you have a follow-up question.
Thank you very much, Eric. I saw Ezekiel raise the hand and he put it down. If you still have a question, Mr. Ezekiel?
Yes, I still have my question. I'm sorry for coming late, but at least for a few minutes I've been listening to, I got an idea of what was said. I will probably catch up with the link on YouTube. Here's my question. When it comes to trust, when exactly can someone who owns properties can transfer those properties into a trust? Let's say the case of a person who got a property through a bond. Will still the bank allow such person to put the properties in a trustee account before he completely finished the bond repayment? Is that possible or not? If it's not possible, why? And if it's possible, what are the process or the avenue that such person have to take? Thank you. I don't know if it's one of the questions that was covered, but as I came late, it's one of the questions that concern me. Thanks.
Okay, Eric?
Yes, thank you. That's a very good question. Thank you for that. So in the past, people used to use trusts to find a way to avoid paying tax, because now what you do is with a trust, you create a legal entity, basically another person, and you transfer all your assets to that person. So all the debts that were under your name are no longer attached to those assets. And if you are if you have a lot of debt, for example, they can't now go and repossess those assets because those assets now belong to the trust. They don't belong to you. Okay. And so the SARS, the Revenues Service in South Africa, have found ways to circumvent that, to tax people in trust as much as possible. Okay, so the trusts are not becoming as advantageous as they used to be because, first of all, for you to, when you transfer an asset from your name to a trust, you'll pay what's called capital gains tax. Okay, so how the tax man sees it is that you are selling your assets to the trust. Okay, so if you say you are just giving your assets to the trust, for example, you don't sell it, you'll pay a donations tax. Okay, so when you're transferring assets from your name to the trust, there's a tax implication in that process. Okay. Also, a trust is taxed at 40% per year. Okay. So if the trust makes money, for example, if you have a property, that property makes rent, okay, you make a rental income from that property, that property will pay tax at 40% flat rate, okay? So that's actually higher tax than you would pay at your individual capacity, okay? Depending on your salary. So at what point should you consider a trust? If you've got at least 5 properties or more, then it becomes cost effective. If you don't have a substantial amount of assets, it becomes too expensive to maintain the trust because the tax man knows that people have been using it to try and avoid taxes, to try and hide assets. So they've become more severe and punitive on trusts. Okay, so that means that's something you have to consider. When it comes to estate duty, which is another tax that we were talking about at death, you pay estate duty when you have assets of more than 3.5 million rands. Okay, anything below that, you won't pay any estate duty. So already that means that you are working with numbers of 3 million rands upwards for you to even think about a trust. So the idea is that you need to have a substantial amount of assets. To answer your question directly, can you transfer your house to a trust even while you still have a bond? 100% yes, you can. You can do that transfer as soon as you want. Just remember that when you transfer that house from your name to the name of the trust, you will pay capital gains tax. So you'll pay a tax for that transfer that happens. If you transfer that house at a lower value, you'll pay a donation. They'll call it a donation. You pay donations tax. And once the asset is in the name of the trust, there's a 40% tax that you pay on the income that you make from that trust. So unless you have a substantial amount of assets, it doesn't become a cost-effective way to manage your finances.
Thank you, Eric. I just wanted to say one thing. As I think Anis spoke about investment in DRC and property. We had Patrick Katabwa that presented in one of our sessions about investment and properties. So if Anis would like to have more information about that, we can put you in contact with Patrick so that you can fructify your communication and your knowledge about investing in DRC. Because Patrick was looking for investors as well for DRC, for Lubumbashi and Kinshasa in particular. Thank you. If we still have somebody with a question or want to raise one point, quelqu'un a une question ou bien vous voulez parler de quelque chose sur CoopCongo ou bien de notre burial scheme que nous sommes en train de faire la promotion pour que nous puissions lancer le plus vite possible. On a déjà dépassé notre temps de 19 minutes. Encore, je demande votre indulgence. Thank you very much for Patrick contact. You can still contact him. He is one of us here in CoopCongo, and we are happy to see our members progress. Le chairman a partagé aussi le lien pour notre session de ce soir. Plutôt la présentation sur les properties que Patrick Katabwe nous avait présenté. Nous, comme j'avais dit auparavant, nous avons déjà notre jeune avocat qui va nous présenter à partir du mois d'avril sur les lois sur mères porteuses, surrogacy in South Africa. Je crois que c'est très important aussi, surtout pour les médecins, les lois qui régissent. Et puis, il va aussi nous parler dans l'autre session sur les régimes de mariage que vous avez. Ça, c'est juste pour le mois d'avril. Et après ça, il y aura une session sur l'importance d'avoir un testament. Ce sont des jeunes Congolais avocats ici en Afrique du Sud et nous voulons aider la communauté le plus possible. C'est pourquoi nous alignons des sujets qui touchent à nos vies sociales. Comme Eric avait parlé ici, sur l'importance d'avoir un testament, le will. And we have somebody that will speak to us about the will, about matrimonials? Would you like your marriage, especially those who want to venture into business? What is the how do you have to plan your marriage? So I think we don't have hands. I would like to pass the words to my chairman again for the words of closing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Njeka. Merci beaucoup, notre secrétaire général. Thank you very much for the session. It is really, really, really a big, big pleasure, and thank you to Mr. Malepe for all this time. It takes a lot of time to prepare these sessions, and we know. So we thank you so much. We are online, so I can't give you the flowers that I have here, but we will send them via courier. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Now, we also thank the participants, members of the community, members of the CoopCongo cooperative. Even if it is one person that is here, the session will go on. So we really appreciate taking 1 hour every 2 weeks so that we share this time. We appreciate. Donc, nous remercions tous les membres, tous les participants de pouvoir partager ce temps avec nous, et nous remercions sincèrement Monsieur Eric Malepe et tous les autres qui viennent. Monsieur Eric, ça prend beaucoup de temps pour préparer ces sessions, et merci beaucoup pour ce partage de haut niveau. Ce sont nos frères qui sont des professionnels et qui partagent ces expériences et leur connaissance à la communauté. Donc, nous ne pouvons que vous remercier pour ce grand partage. And see you in 2 weeks' time. À nous revoir dans 2 semaines. Merci beaucoup à vous, Monsieur le Secrétaire général. Bonne soirée à tous.
Bonsoir, merci beaucoup.
Merci, bonsoir.
Merci beaucoup à tout le monde, et on se revoit dans 2 semaines pour une autre session. Merci beaucoup et bonne soirée.